talking about Genderspeak, which is not an original word for me. Somebody else probably coined it quite a bit about, probably coined it much earlier. The language that men speak is not necessarily the language that women hear. And what I'd like you to begin to think of right from the very start is about becoming multilingual. Okay? Being able to speak more than one language. So there's 3 parts to the presentation. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about myths and misconceptions about differences in language between men and women. I also want to talk about major differences that do exist between the 2 genders, generally speaking. And part 3, modifications. I had to have 3 M's. You know, I had to make one. But what kind of changes? What can you do in order to communicate more effectively, regardless of the gender of the person that you're talking to? Now, there's some, we're going to start with a few little warnings, just so we keep your blood pressure down. Okay? Number 1, you won't agree with everything I say. That's okay. It indicates that there's a level of thinking going on. Thinking is always good. 2, you may not like everything you hear. That's okay too. Not everything that is said about women is true for all women, and not everything that I'm going to talk about with men's communication style, preferred style, is true about all men. What tends to happen when I make these kinds of presentations, and when we talk about associating communication styles with gender, is if you find that there's something that you do that is characteristic of the opposite gender, oh my gosh, the anxiety goes right up. People, does that mean that I'm not totally male? Men tend to have a little bit more anxiety around this issue for whatever reason. What I want you to do is to think about this less in terms of communication equals gender, but I want you to think about it in terms of becoming multilingual. Think about going, I just got back from Asia. A friend and I took a trip overseas and went to Asia. And of course, you're surrounded by people speaking different languages, and you try to pick up thank you or hello. I mean, we're Canadians, we're polite, so thank you and hello in whatever the native language is. Sometimes you're effective, and sometimes you mispronounce words. And that's actually what happens when you're speaking English to people whose background, whose culture, whose socialization is totally different. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that if you were fortunate enough as a female to grow up with brothers, you're going to understand a lot more about the way men communicate than if you grew up with no siblings or if you grew up only with sisters. And if you were, as a young male, fortunate enough to grow up with a bunch of sisters instead of brothers, or an only child, you're going to understand a lot more about the way women communicate. So you will have some degree of bilingualism that you will feel comfortable about. So please don't think or worry that these particular examples I'm going to give you completely define one's sexuality. I wish it were that simple. It's really not. So let's take a look at some of the myths and misperceptions. And they start really, really early in life, don't they? Not only do we used to have little pink things for girls and little blue things, but I can remember going back how many years now, or what are little boys made of? You know, snips and snails and puppy dog tails, and I always thought, poor dog. Or little girl, sugar and spice and everything nice, and since I wasn't a nice little girl, that didn't fit. It certainly had a bit of confusion in growing up. But we do have these sexual stereotypes that start very, very early in life. As a matter of fact, there's some research, I mean, think about it. You've got a female employee off on that leave, and of course she will come back with the baby to show it off at the office. Okay? The first question you ask, is it a boy or is it a girl? We ask that about dogs. If we see a dog, oh, is it he or she? And you know, if we misgender the dog, the owner gets very upset. Okay? Well, we do this certainly with children. Is it a girl or boy? Now, the interesting thing is, and this is what the research says, is that If the woman says, it's a little boy, it's a boy, you say, oh, isn't he cute? Even if he looks like a cabbage. If it's a little girl, you're going to say, oh, isn't she cute? The tone of voice that we speak to about and to children will differ in terms of how we perceive their gender. We lower our tone when we talk to boys. We, right from infant time on, we begin to set expectations about what a normal male behavior and interaction begins to look like. And this starts very, very early in life. So it's not surprising that by the time we get into the workforce, we find that there is some confusion. We have myths then. You laugh. Yeah, but this is under myths and misperceptions, so they just keep that in mind. Not sure if you could read that at the back, and she says, it says here that women use over 20% more words than men. Really? This is subtle. I don't think every one of you has figured this out. Few late bloomers, yes. The research in terms of how many words do people typically use in a day, with the stereotype of perception is that women chatter. They talk on and on and on. The people who have that perception are men because they think the things that women talk about are irrelevant. So of course it sounds like chatter. Women tend to think the same thing about men when they talk about sports, particularly if it's a sport you have no interest in, or racing cars. But here's what the research says, folks, in case you're interested, is that studies show that men talk more than women in business situations. They also tend, as we'll see a little bit later when we talk about nonverbals, they also tend to take up more time and space in meetings. And it's really interesting is if without changing your body position, you can just swivel your head. It's really interesting as I look over to see the various body positions in the room. Women are sitting like this. Men are stretched out. Take a look at the amount of space that men occupy. And if you really want to frustrate a man, when you go into a meeting, push everything right in front of them so they don't have any space. And see how long it takes for them to push it back and occupy that kind of space. We have myths about interruptions, for example, and the research again suggests that men and women interrupt about equally, but the interruptions are different. Women tend to interrupt by talking along with. And so somebody will say something, oh, you know, I was in Asia, and the women are going to say, oh yeah, I've gone to Asia too, and they talk along with it. What happens in women, I'm going to keep throwing in little tidbits, so pay attention. Little tidbits about how to improve your communications is that women do this to men all the time, and they don't recognize how frustrating it is for the guys when this happens. Because when a man finally does want to tell you something, before you know it, you have stolen his story, and it's all about you. Men, on the other hand, interrupt as well, but they interrupt by changing the topic. You're talking about something that you think is phenomenally interested, they could care less about it, and they say, oh yeah, speaking of which, how did we just go 180 degrees in the wrong direction? And of course, this was one of the biggest liberating things for men in the whole world, is that we have the myth that men don't cry, big boys don't cry. And of course, you're taught this really, really early. You know, if you ever watch minor hockey, right? It is so much fun with the little 5- and 6-year-olds, right? They're out on the ice, this is their first game, and they got their little helmet and their little gloves and stick in their skates, and they're on their ankles, and they're 6 years old, and some big 7-year-old comes along and knocks them over, and they're sitting there on the ice. And mom and dad and the coach are hanging over the board saying, come on son, suck it up, don't cry. Men get that, message very, very early in life is that real men don't cry, no matter how hard, how much it hurts, how hard it is to keep the tears down. They suck it up. They're tough. And we get misunderstandings because of that, because some women have told me, oh, well, men don't experience things emotionally the way women do. Nonsense, of course they do. They absolutely feel the same. I mean, emotions are emotions. They're not gender specific. But what is very clearly different is what is considered an appropriate response to the emotions that you feel. What we find with a lot of men, and I think it's very, very helpful for women to understand this, is that very often when men are afraid, they show the fear by getting angry. We see this particularly if people go into, when men go into hospitals. And hospitals, if you're not used to it, are very, very scary places. And you don't know what the procedures are, and perhaps the diagnosis is going to be really, really tough. And all of a sudden, before you know it, the men are really irritable, they're aggressive, they're challenging everything, they are really angry. And you're thinking, these people just want to help, like what's this coming from? And it's coming from a deep sense of fear, of not knowing what's going on, of not having any control, of being unaware of what kinds of processes are, and all of a sudden, you get that fear which you've never been allowed to express. But anger is very masculine. It's okay for a man to shout. It's not okay for a man to cry. Well, thank you, Brett Favre, and all the other athletes who retire can sob. And it's interesting to see how sympathetic the announcers are when this happens, if they don't ignore it completely. So what does the research say are the major differences that, generally speaking, men and women experience? And it starts, as I mentioned earlier, way back in childhood as kids. And boys play, first of all, competitive games. Everything with little boys is a competition. I can throw a ball. That's nothing I can throw it across the street. That's nothing I can throw it across the city. Well, I can throw it right to the moon. Okay? Little boys boast. Little girls are taught not to boast. And of course, what happens as adults is men still boast about very strange things. Not what you're thinking. I can remember going to a dinner party, and I overheard after, you know what happens. I mean, we're still, so, even though we're aware of this, we still fall into sexual roles. So the guys are standing around in the living room, and the women are cleaning up the dishes and helping put everything away in the kitchen, right? And I overhear the guy saying, and one of the fellows says to the host, he says, "Mine," he said, "that was an absolutely marvelous meal that your wife cooked. It was absolutely phenomenal." One of the other guys said, "Yeah, it was really amazing." He says, "You know," he said, "I can't cook at all." One of the other guys said, "Nah, me neither. As a matter of fact, I can't even boil an egg." And the third one says, "That's something I can't even find in the kitchen." They're boasting about how terrible they are. This is a very guy kind of thing. Women don't boast. They commiserate with one another. Another major difference that starts really, really very early, because boys are very competitive, is they establish a very, very strong sense of hierarchy. And as a little boy, your whole energy is to not be at the bottom of the totem pole where everybody pushes you around. And status for little boys is gained depending on the number of people that you can boss around. You can tell everybody to do things and they do it, you're a leader. Some of the research that Deborah Tannen has done around children said it's very interesting, is that little boys, as early as play school, will tell other little boys, "Go get that." Ah, we have a little leader in the making. Next premier, watch for it. When little girls do that, they're called bossy. Bossy is a term that is almost never applied to boys or men. It's almost always applied toward women. So women have to learn very subtle, some may say manipulative ways of getting done with it on men. So what little girls tend to do is they don't say, "Go get that." They say, "Let's you and me go over here and get that, okay?" And then they shove the other little kid over to go and get it. girls learn that it is socially acceptable for people to do things together, to be combined, to be collegial, to work in teams, to work in groups. Whereas little boys understand that the world is about hierarchy and the world is about competition, and they learn to work in a team. But you know the first thing that guys do when they get a whole group together? They elect a captain. Somebody's got to be in charge. When women are in a team, they usually don't, and that's not their first role to do, is to select a captain. And if they have to select somebody, they usually elect co-captains. It's not just one person, it's shared. Little girls, on the other hand, enjoy games that involve taking turns. They develop empathy for people, and they regard rules a little bit more flexibly. And so double dutch, I don't know about you folks, but certainly when I was growing up, we played double dutch. Okay, so the ropes are going like this. You got two people with the ropes, like on the screen. And everybody gets to go in and skip. Now, if the ropes kiss, which was the term that we used, sexuality was alive and well in 8-year-olds. If the ropes were to kiss, well then it wasn't the skipper's fault and she got to go down. The boys on the other hand would say, tough. Now, girls would cooperate, everybody would go in until they went out, the next person would come in and they'd take their turn and they would go out. Now you know what would happen if the little boys were on the ropes. Okay. They would be pulling them tight and trying to take the head off of the kid. And then they brag about the number of beheadings. What happens because of these early childhood situations that we are involved? Boys, in order to get status, have best friends. And the friends help them navigate through the growing up period. But how little boys treat their best friends and how they talk to their best friends is very different than how women, little girls, talk to and develop their best friends. And we see this ramification as adults. I've often said is that men, starting from the time they're boys, men bond through teasing and women bond through complaining. It's true. It's true. If you've got a really best friend, you can tease that person, and he's your best friend, and he smiles. And they call each other terrible names. Hey, mouse. Yeah. Okay. Women do not tease one another. And a lot of men do not understand that women do not take teasing the same way that men do. Teasing for women is not a sign of affection. It is a sign of dominance. Why not? What women do is we complain, and our expectation is we complain to our best friends. And we say, oh, you can't imagine the terrible day I've had. Bad boss, bad coworker, bad client, whatever. And if she is your best friend, she says, oh, I know exactly how you feel. Now, I have never seen two guys, one of whom has a problem talking to his best friend, where the guy says to his best friend, you won't believe this jerk I'm working for. And his best friend says, oh, I know exactly how you feel. What he's probably going to say if he's a best friend is, bummer. Sucks to be you, man. So women come home at night and they tell their partner, whom they love dearly and completely, about the terrible life, day, situation that exists. Their husband, who loves them equally well, wants to help. And of course, how do men help? They give advice. And they can't understand why their partner is so ticked. Men, here's a tip for you. When your partner comes home and complains, your response should be, sounds like you had a terrible day, let me take you out for supper. That's it. That's it, just shut up. You're not giving them advice. We oftentimes think that when we use the same words that we mean the same thing, and we don't. This can get very, very confusing. Let me give you an example. Apologies. When women say, oh, I'm sorry, they are not necessarily apologizing for a fault that they have committed. When they say, I'm sorry, they may mean, I'm sorry that you were put in an uncomfortable kind of situation. Right? Men will only use the words, I'm sorry, when they actually want to make an apology, which doesn't happen quite that often, very often. But again, you see, making an apology and admitting that you made a mistake is something that positionally puts you in a one-down position. And men have been socialized to keep out of that one-down position. And so they just figure, okay, let's just move on, forget it, and I'll not do that kind of thing again. And that nodding, which is a non-verbal but a very important kind of communication thing, is that women might say, oh yeah, okay, sure. Men, when they hear that from a female, think that women are agreeing with them. Thus, they are really surprised when they go on and on and on, and the woman's going, yeah, I see, okay, yeah, sure, okay. When they finally finish, the woman then says, yeah, but I don't agree with you. What? You just spent 10 minutes giving me, yeah, okay. And when women nod their head and say, yeah, okay, what the message that they're sending is, I understand what you are saying, keep going. So women, if you don't want men to go on and on and on, quit giving them nonverbal reinforcers. Quit nodding your head, quit saying, okay, yeah, because men are not going to do that for you. They're going to sit there and listen to you, and they are critically evaluating what you're saying. See, one of the things is that women have been socialized to give support. Men have been socialized to critique and make things better. So even if you're out in the dog park, and you've got your little dog and you're walking along and they're running off leash and everything else, you meet another person out with a dog, and they say, oh, which dog was yours? Oh, the shepherd over there. Oh, isn't he cute? What a great dog. And you then become known as Bailey's mom. Okay? You got a guy, and he says, so which one's your dog? And you say, oh, the shepherd over there. He's likely to say, a little undersized, isn't he? That's why women who expect compliments are sorely doomed. You are more likely to get a critical evaluation than you are a compliment, than you are an acknowledgement. Men seldom are going to say, oh, what a great looking puppy that is. What a sweetheart. They're just not going to say that. So we need to be careful that we don't make those assumptions, that we use the same words in exactly the same way. We may want the same results, but we express ourselves differently, leading us sometimes to think that we have different kinds of goals. This oftentimes occurs when we need to make decisions. Oftentimes how we process decisions can really vary by gender. Men typically, although there certainly are exceptions, but men typically do not process information out loud. They go through it in their heads, and when they have finally processed the information, then they come out with their results. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to think out loud, thereby encouraging other people to add their comments, add their thoughts, add their perceptions to it. So when women are going on and thinking out loud, men lose patience, have a tendency to lose patience very, very quickly. Like, thinking is messy. Okay? Thinking really is messy. There may be some people who think in a linear fashion. We call them accountants. Okay? There may be some people who think in a linear fashion, but that's not how we manage the world. Our thoughts are really messy. Men tend to internalize that and not share that messiness. And they come out with the decision at the end. So both men and women want to make good decisions, but how we go about that, the process that we use, can be very, very different. If there's one thing I really noticed and how this gets expressed in terms of organizational behavior, is that very often in organizations that are led by women, particularly non-profit, there is a feeling right from the executive director down that when they have a staff meeting and they discuss issues, everybody's viewpoint is equally important. Even if you have no knowledge or understanding, I still want to hear from you, but what do you think about X? This drives men crazy. Because if I'm going to be held responsible for a job, you don't know my job, you're not going to be held responsible. Why should I care what you think? Whereas women who tend to operate much better in a collegial, consensus-building type of environment want input from everybody. Men think this is a terrible waste of time, and who cares? The only person who they need any kind of agreement from or input from is their boss, not from other people. On that. Certainly we've talked about, and all of us are aware of relationships, and women are supposed to be relationship-oriented. This leads us to I think a huge misperception on the part of many women. I've had a lot of HR people ask me to come in, particularly with technical people like engineers or technologist types, and say, well, we want a communication class because these engineers don't communicate very well. And I think to myself, I just say it to myself, I don't say them because I do want work, but I think to myself, engineers communicate with each other just fine. They don't communicate with HR very well, admittedly, but they do communicate with each other. But this whole idea about relationships is very different because women want relationships first, and then they can engage in great work. Men, on the other hand, have a much higher tendency to form relationships because the work is going well. Okay? It's almost a complete inversion. If the team works well, we really get along well. Women, on the other hand, want the team to operate well, and then. So here's your example. Let's say that we have two curling teams who are both going to the Briars, male and female, and let's say that both of them lost their second in a car accident, and their second had broken leg and couldn't play. The men would say, who is the best second in the province that we can pick up? Because it's about being successful at the task. The women would say, who do we like who can play second really, really well? That ability to bring in people that you really like, which will then make a great team. Which I think is one of the reasons why we find a lot of conflict in highly female organizations that exist around issues that are completely different than in male organizations. And it's much more difficult, in my experience, to insert a new female player into a group of females who've worked together for a long time than it is to insert a new male player into a group of men who have worked together. When you put in a new man into a group of all men, there will be an initial testing period, and if the guy passes the test, he's in. Okay? With women, that new person may never be part of the group. Ever. They may not allow that person to be able to make it in. Example of the nonverbals is pretty much there. There are a few other kinds of things that we should be aware of, is that women will use more direct eye contact than men will. And I want to correct your perception that probably many of you got when you took your first communications 101 class. Remember how the instructor told you, you got to sit right across from somebody, you have to maintain eye contact, and you nod, and you do all these kinds of things. That is a very atypical way for men to communicate. When men communicate, particularly around important things, look at guys who sit in a bar. Okay? They're not sitting across from each other, leaning forward and gazing into each other's eyes. They're sitting shoulder to shoulder. You're sitting shoulder to shoulder, and occasionally they look at each other. And I think that when we go in and we present a model that this is how you should communicate, I think we made it really difficult for men to improve their communication processes with other males. I think that works with women because women want that connectedness. But you see, all men know that if you've got somebody who walks over to you straight on, that means the fight is on, doesn't it? Okay? That's a challenge. That is a potential assault. Men very often, if they don't want to come across and being perceived as in a fighting mode, antagonistic, will come at an oblique angle. And just watch sports. Sports is one of the best examples because you can count right off the bat when there's going to be a scrap. Because the first thing the guys do is they square off and look at each other. And then they close the distance and the fight is on. You never see a fight starting with somebody sidling out for somebody. Is it want to go? So because women are more relationship oriented, particularly as a precursor to achieving good results in a team, they tend to establish and really work hard at getting a consensus. And there's nothing wrong with establishing a consensus, as long as you understand clearly that a consensus does not mean that everybody has to agree. It's really helpful if you understand that a consensus really means that everybody has perhaps a chance to express how they see about things. But at the end of the day, somebody has to make the decision. Now that's a very male-oriented kind of approach to things. But I've often said, and I really do believe, is that we have to get over the idea somehow that work is daycare for adults. Okay? Businesses are about achieving objectives. And while there are different ways of going about it, at the end of the day, people will be judged on whether or not they achieved the results that they were supposed to achieve. Men oftentimes assume the position of an expert. This tends to be much more embedded in the male environment than in the female. So what happens, because they have an expectation that they should be an expert or some interesting kinds of things, number one is that very few men will ever admit that they don't know something. If they don't know, they will make it up or they will fake it. I have learned to be very, very careful about asking men, for example, for directions about how to get any place. I was out taking a corporate plane up somewhere a number of years ago at the Calgary airport, and I couldn't find the hangar. So as I was driving by, I saw a bunch of guys out for a smoke break at one of the airport places on the airport land. So I thought, okay, so I went over, and I said, do you know where the Sunwest hangar is? Oh yeah, the guy said, here, and here. Okay, now I'm good at following directions. Followed his directions, and I was almost out in the air dirty. Before I realized is that he had absolutely no friggin' idea where this hangar was, but he would not say, I don't know. Particularly to women. If you're a guy and a woman asks you something, you are genetically obliged to give her an answer. Go this way. I was doing a workshop one time for a bunch of oil guys up in Fox Creek at Allegiant, and it was not particularly well equipped for training, which is fine, but they had one of those, remember those great big huge screens that you had to have in order to show overhead projectors? And for whatever reason, I couldn't get the screen up. I didn't know if I wasn't strong enough, or if I wasn't pressing the right buttons or whatever. So I got 18 oil workers around sitting all there, sitting there, and I said, does anybody know how to get the screen up? Well, immediately 6 of them come roaring up to help, because men feel that their mission in life is to help women. So they 6 of them come whipping up to help, and it became clear in a nanosecond that they didn't know any more than I did about how to operate the screen. But they wouldn't say it. They were going to help. That was their imperative. The cultural imperative was to help out. So I'm extremely cautious. And we see with IT people, in my next life I want to come back like Mike. Mike is my model for IT. He's helpful, he gets things done, everything works really well. But some of you may notice that if you're working with IT, if you're working with a guy, an IT specialist, you will say, can you get this done? Now IT people want to be helpful, they're really bright, they know a lot of stuff. They always say yes. So I suggest that there are 3 follow-up questions that you must ask. Number 1, Have you ever done this before? 2, are we going to finish this in my lifetime? Number 3, is there enough money in the whole world to pay for this? Because you see, IT guys who are really bright, figure when I have enough money, they will figure it out. Women, on the other hand, do not have this imperative that they have to know everything. It is not within their socialization to be an expert. It's okay to say, I don't know. And guys, you will make phenomenal inroads with the women in your life if you get over the compulsion to think that you have to know it all in order to be seen as adequate. It is very endearing to women when they hear a man say, I don't know. I can help you find out. Here's what we can do. Here's what we might try. But to simply admit, I don't know. Because women are so relationship-oriented, the whole idea of conflict, which I referred to earlier, is rather interesting, is that an agreement about A impacts their entire relationship. It's either all or nothing. Whereas guys can end up in a meeting, scream and yell and shout at each other, and then go out and have a beer. Like, what has this got to do with this? You can argue about individual things, and it doesn't impact or affect your entire relationship. Women generally have a much more difficult time doing that, which is one of the reasons why I think they work so hard at building consensus. Is at the end of the day, they want everybody to agree and everybody to get along, because that will impact the next project and the next project and the next project. Okay? With guys, it's as if the things are independent. So we see, as a quick recap then, is that men focus on independence, and women tend to focus on intimacy, on closeness. This is why women need to be very, very careful. You get a young guy who's just come in, he's brand new. And you walk by his office, he's only been there a week, and he's already 3 months behind. He's got papers all over the place. So you really, really want to be helpful. So you walk in and you say, do you need any help? What's the guy going to say? No, I got it. Right? Because he doesn't want you to think that he's a weenie, that he's not competent. And the reason for that is that for men especially who grow up playing positional sports, here's where this comes from. You grow up playing positional sports like hockey or like football especially, North American football, not soccer. You grow up and where you play, you have certain responsibilities and there are rules that govern what you can do and what you can't do. And your coach is telling you right from the earliest part of your life in sports is play your position, play your position, play your position. And if you're really good, the theory is that if everybody on the team plays their position appropriately, the team will win. Okay, that's the theory behind it. And if you don't play your position, then somebody has to come over and help you out. And that is a big sign that you are a failure, that you're not very good. Okay? So what's the first thing you get when you start into a new organization? A position description. And this means is that if you're going to be a really good worker, you should be able to do it by yourself without any help. You know the old saying, I don't need no stinking help. Okay? You need to be independent, you need to play your position. Women, on the other hand, how this really, really impacts us then is that we go around and we say, do you need some help? And the person says yes, we think that's great. So what happens is that women complain that men never help out. And I say this scene is repeated throughout North America, probably on a daily basis. Why don't you ever help out around the house? Okay? He doesn't know what his job is. If you give him his job, he'd be glad to do his job. But helping out around the house, that is so amorphous. It is so ambivalent. Ladies, get over it. Just say, here's your job, and here are the specs, here are the standards. You got the bathroom, here's what I got to look for. I mean, may as well give it up. Just worrying is, why don't you tell me what you want to do? I shouldn't have to tell you. You live here too. You know, conversation goes on and on. Well, we find the same thing in the workplace. You see, with teams, we've got this whole different current idea of how people should behave appropriately in teams. Men believe that the team is successful when everybody plays his position and plays it really well, and nobody has to come over and cover off or help out. Women, on the other hand, think that teams, everybody helps everybody else out. So what this means is that women will often complain is how come the men don't offer to help? And I say to them, why don't you ask? Well, we shouldn't have to ask. I mean, it just keeps going around. We get better. Probably in our DNA, which leads to another thing, is that women tend to be more indirect than do men. Now, guys, if you have a female boss, you may have already figured this out. If not, this may be worth the whole conference for you. When your boss, who is female, gives you a suggestion, that is an order. Women do not like ordering other people around. It creates distance. It creates hierarchy. So they will come in and they will say, I think it would be a good idea if we did a phone survey. And the young guy says, yeah, I think that'd be a good idea. A week later, there's no phone survey. And she's wondering, well, I told the guy. Well, that's not what he heard. She said, I think it would be a good idea. He's agreeing it would probably be a good idea. Did she say you should do it? No. Okay? And so that sensitivity. So on the one hand, women will be better if you're dealing with men. If you want men to do something, give them a direct request. Do not hint. And believe it or not, men are not going to be upset when because you have the appropriate position within the organization, they're not going to be upset that you're giving them orders. This is what guys expect in a hierarchical organization. And so here's what we found the differences were on this. We have the differences. And here are some coping mechanisms. Everything that I said about men as being true of it, you think now about in terms of warriors. The warriors see life and they see their existence as a contest, a battle, and a struggle. And the people around them are opponents or enemies. They're adversaries. They're people that you have to fight against and continually have to be on guard because they may do damage to you. The villagers, on the other hand, don't see life as threatening. They form relationships because it's really critical for people to work together, to be connected, in order to have the village survive. So if it's a contest with other people, the villagers think that this is a small close knit where any kind of disagreement is going to destroy the village, so don't have it. Warriors assume that everybody else wants to win, whereas villagers say, well, our interests are all together. It's not about winners or losers. A warrior won't expose any weakness to anybody else because they're afraid that if you talk about what your weakness is, your enemy will take advantage of it. Villagers believe that everybody in the village succeeds or fails together. And so if I tell you what my weakness is, I can find somebody whose strengths will supplement it so that the good of the whole group. Now, understand clearly that one is not better than the other. They clearly are different orientations. Warriors have a code, maybe a sense of honor. And they really admire their enemies. And if we just look back into history about the warriors, you eat the heart of the person that you just killed in battle because you admire the strength. And the villagers are going, Villagers form friendships with people in their own village. For a warrior, they want to be really, really self-confident. And they will do whatever it takes to be successful to win the battle. The villagers have to learn how to work with everybody else and to be an essential member of the teams. Okay, so what we find then, in terms of some clear strategies, things to be aware of, is this: if you are a warrior, and those of you in this audience right now who know you are warriors, you know who you are. Okay? You're competitive. It's win or lose. If other people are upset, that's the way the cookie crumbles, isn't it? They'll get over it. The most important thing is getting the results. And yes, we would prefer that people get along, but if it comes to a fight, it's going to come to a fight. And villagers, you know who you are. Okay? Why can't we get along? Why can't we work peacefully together? Why can't we all have a good relationship? So warriors, don't stab the villagers. They're not your enemy. So keep your conflict professional. No yelling, no screaming, no raging hissy fits. Don't shoot down ideas, because if you shoot down ideas, the villagers are not going to shoot back. They will withdraw. They will retreat. Villagers, on the other hand, don't take everything so personally. A lot of the stuff, here's a good example. It's what I refer to with the North Koreans right now. It's bellicose verbosity. Okay? The North Koreans have ramped up the war of words. Okay? And it's a game that they play. And their expectations are that other countries will understand this verbal conflict and it will lead them to behave in a way that North Korea wants. At least that's what the majority of people that I've talked to in Seoul were thinking in terms of the previous history. And so they don't take it as seriously, perhaps, as those people think, well, if you say this, then this means you're going to do it. Villagers need to understand is that you can be teased. Warriors will tease you because that's a mark of camaraderie. You tease equals, you tease your friends. Women very often in the villagers, teasing is a mark that you don't like somebody. When women tease, it very frequently has an edge to it. Okay? Whereas guys tease because they grow up with teasing. Make it easy for villagers to deliver bad news. One of the complaints that we get from the warriors is that villagers are indirect. And I say, well, what role do you think you're playing in having villagers indirect? Well, of course, what happens is if there's bad news, and then the warriors go ballistic, and you have the villagers who loathe and hate and are afraid of conflict. The easiest way to avoid the conflict is don't come in and tell you what's going wrong. Now, this is really hard because warriors' lives, their very existence, back in real warrior time, depended on your ability to react very quickly and very strongly against any particular adversary or things that go wrong. In the modern business world, we don't need that instantaneous physical kind of response. And so understanding that these are villagers and understanding and listening to them rather than reacting the way you might to another warrior who's threatening you is a good strategy. Villagers, on the other hand, don't keep the truth from them just because you fear conflict. And this is easier said than done, I understand. Warriors first connect with villagers on a professional level, then business. This means, and it's really hard, but this means when you come in the morning, say hello to everyone. Ask them how their weekend was, or how their dogs are, or how their kids are going. You know, coming in and simply saying, get this done, or even please get this done, is not a very good approach with people who are villagers. It's not about the politeness, it is about the relationship. Villagers, and this is really true for a lot of women and men, is respect their need for silence and solitude. Don't invade their emotional response. A lot of women feel so frustrated because they feel, if I don't know how you're feeling, I can't be close to you, I can't be connected. And that is an opinion that is not shared by a whole bunch of men. And it is seen oftentimes as intrusive to ask people, like, how are you feeling? Why are you asking? Because to tell somebody how you feel makes you vulnerable. If you said, oh, I feel really scared about this, this may not work out right, then people potentially have an ace that they could play against you. If you're a warrior, if you see that life is competitive, then revealing any kind of fear, any kind of anxiety gives your opponents a potential leg up on that. You don't want to do that. Villagers fight differently than warriors. Don't start with a nuclear attack. All right, calm it down, ramp it down. Try to discuss things on a calm level to begin with. But villagers, please understand that hidden aggression, passive-aggressive behavior, is as bad for warriors as abrasive conflict is for you. Now, if somebody says, if a warrior finally says and begins to want to start working on the relationship, if they say, so what's wrong, do not say, nothing. How is everything? Fine. Okay? Men begin eventually to figure that fine does not mean fine. Fine means you are in big trouble. And you better figure it out because I'm not going to tell you. Think of teams. Warriors, try to think of your team as a boat crew in storm. Everybody has to work together. Whereas villagers, try to think of teams as a football team where everybody has a specific role to play. And you don't expect an offensive lineman to go out and catch a pass. Okay? You don't expect your goalie to score goals. Everybody has a specific role to play. Warriors ramp it down. Warrior behavior is seen frequently as rude, aggressive, and self-serving. Whereas villagers up your level of assertiveness, or else you will be seen as a wimp and powerless. Don't confuse cooperation with being a wimp or incompetent. Give up the mask of invincibility and omnipotence. And villagers, bottom line, is about winning. As I said before, business is not daycare for adults. A warrior team is not about democracy, liking fellow team members, or feeling good. It's one of the reasons why I've always said one of the most useful things you can do for your daughters is to get them involved in some sort of competitive team environment, whether it's ringette or hockey or softball or any kind of sport that is available in your community, because girls learn lessons from playing team sports that boys have been able to learn forever, even if they're not very good. They learn that you cooperate. They learn that you throw the ball to whoever you have to throw it to, not because you like them. I thought it was so interesting. I've got a couple of grandnieces who are just beginning to play ringette. And their dad commented, I was watching one of the games, and they said, well, you know, they're not very good at passing. And the dad said, they only pass to their friends. They only pass to their friends. It takes a couple of years of coaching for girls to learn that you pass to the person who is open. Okay? That's a fundamental difference. Those of you who have kids who have seen that, if you got girls, you know that is true. Let me just do a very quick finish with a wonderful article that I pulled off a number of years ago that really comprises, I think, one of the major differences between the way men and women communicate. Contrary to what many women believe, it's fairly easy to develop a long-term, stable, intimate, and mutually fulfilling relationship with a guy. Of course, this guy has to be a Labrador Retriever. With human guys, it's extremely difficult. This is because guys don't really grasp what women mean by the term relationship. Let's say a guy named Roger is attracted to a woman named Elaine. He asks her out to a movie, she accepts. They have a pretty good time. A few nights later, he asks her out to dinner, and again they enjoy themselves. They continue to see each other regularly, and after a while, neither of them is seeing anybody else. And then, one evening, when they're driving home, a thought occurs to Elaine, and without really thinking, she says it aloud. Do you realize that as of tonight, we've been seeing each other for exactly 6 months? And there is silence. To Elaine, it seems like a very loud silence. She thinks to herself, geez, I wonder what bothers him that I said that. Maybe he's feeling confined by our relationship. Maybe he thinks that I'm trying to push him into some side of obligation that he doesn't want or isn't sure of. And Roger's thinking, gosh, 6 months. And Elaine is thinking, but hey, I'm not so sure I want this relationship either. Sometimes I wish I had a little more space, so I have time to think about whether or not I really want to keep going, and when we are, to move steadily forward. I mean, where are we going? Are we just going to keep seeing each other at this level of intimacy? Are we headed toward marriage, toward children, toward a lifetime together? Am I really ready for that level of commitment? Do I even really know know this person. And Roger's thinking, so that means, let's see, February when we started going out, which means it was right after I had the car at the dealer's, which means, let me check the odometer. Whoa, I'm way over the Roger is thinking, and I'm going to have to look at the transmission again. I don't care what those morons say, it's still not shifting right. And they better not try to blame it on the cold weather this time. Cold weather, it's 87 degrees out, and this thing is shifting like a garbage truck, and I play with the incompetent thief $600. And Elaine is thinking, he's angry. And I don't blame him, I'd be angry too. God, I feel so guilty letting him do this, but I can't help the way I feel, I'm just not sure. And Roger was thinking, they'll probably say it's only a 90-day warranty. This is exactly what they're going to say, those scumballs. And Elaine is thinking, maybe I'm just too idealistic. Waiting for a night to come, riding up on this white horse, when I'm sitting right next to a perfectly good person, a person I enjoy being with, a person I really do care about, a person who really seems to care about me, a person who is in pain because of my schoolgirl romantic fantasy. And Roger's thinking, warranty? They want a warranty? I'll give them a warranty. I'll take their warranty and stick it right up there. Roger, Elaine says aloud. What? Says Roger, startled. Please don't torture yourself like this, she says, her eyes beginning to brim with tears. Maybe I should never have. Oh God, I feel so. She breaks down sobbing. What? Says Roger. I'm such a fool, Elaine sobs. I mean, I know there's no night. I really know that. It's silly. There's no night and there's no horse. There's no horse. Says Roger. You think I'm a fool, don't you, Elaine says. No, says Roger, gladly to finally know the right answer. It's just that I need some time, Elaine says. There's a 15-second pause while Roger, thinking as fast as he can, tries to come up with a safe response. Finally, he comes up with one that he thinks might work. Yes, he says. Elaine, deeply moved, touches his hand. Oh, Roger, do you really feel that way? What way? Says Roger. That way about time, says Elaine. Oh, says Roger. Yes. Elaine turns to face him and gazes deeply into his eyes, causing him to become very nervous about what she might say next, especially if it involves a horse. At last she speaks. Thank you, Roger, she says. Thank you, said Roger. And he takes her home, and she lies on her bed, a conflicted, tortured soul, and weeps until dawn, whereas Roger goes back to his place, opens a bag of Doritos, turns on the TV, and immediately becomes deeply involved in a rerun of a tennis match between two Czechoslovakians he's never heard of. A tiny voice in the far recesses of his mind tells him that something major was going on back there in the car. But he's pretty sure that there's no way he would ever understand that. And so he figures it's better if he doesn't think about it. This is also his policy on world peace. The next day, Elaine will call her closest friend, or perhaps two of them, and they will talk about this situation for 6 straight hours. In painstaking detail, they will analyze everything she said and everything he said, going over it time and time again, exploring every word, expression, and gesture for nuances of meaning, considering every possible ramification. They will continue to discuss this subject, off and on for weeks, maybe months, never reaching any definite conclusions, but never getting bored with it either. Meanwhile, Roger, while playing racquetball one day with a mutual friend of his and Elaine's, will pause just before serving, frown, and say, Norm, did Elaine ever own a horse? Betty Davis. When a man gives his opinion, he's a man. When a woman gives her opinion, she's a bitch. And my response to that, and being a bitch is wrong line. As long as she thinks of a man, nobody objects to a woman thinking. And perhaps my favorite that should line this up, Dave Barry. The one thing that unites all human beings, regardless of age, gender, religion, or ethnic background, is that we all believe that we are above average.